learned that song like 2 days before I performed it live. Oh my gosh, and I about puked every time I performed on the show. It was just...
A 12-year-old girl walks out onto a stage in front of a live audience and 3 television cameras, carrying a pink rabbit puppet, and somehow she is the calmest person in the building. That is how most of the world met Darci Lynne. What almost nobody talked about was what came after the confetti settled, the version of fame that doesn't fit neatly into a 2-minute highlight reel. This is that story. Long before America's Got Talent ever knew her name, Darci Lynne Farmer was, by her own description and the description of people who knew her, an unusually shy child. Her mother didn't push her into pageants because she wanted a stage kid. She entered her into small scholarship pageants, hoping it might help her daughter get comfortable talking to strangers and making eye contact. It worked slowly. At one of those pageants, Darci met another young contestant who happened to be a ventriloquist. Darci was fascinated, started asking her every question she could think of, and then went home and practiced in front of her bathroom mirror. That's the whole origin story. No big dramatic reveal, no prodigy narrative handed to her. Just a shy kid in Oklahoma, teaching herself a strange, difficult skill because it made her feel less afraid of an audience. By the time she stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage in the summer of 2017, she had already spent years quietly building toward that moment, one middle school talent show and county fair at a time. Her audition, a rendition of Summertime from Porgy and Bess sung entirely through a puppet named Petunia, is still one of the most watched auditions in the show's history. It has since racked up tens of millions of views. Mel B hit the golden buzzer. 12 weeks later, on September 20th, 2017, Darci Lynne was crowned the winner of Season 12, the youngest champion the show had ever had. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Winning a national talent show doesn't excuse you from 8th grade. Darci went home to Oklahoma City and went back to the same middle school she'd always attended. She has said in multiple interviews that she deliberately chose not to uproot her life. She didn't want to move, and she didn't want to abandon a normal school routine just because her face was suddenly recognizable. But normal had already changed shape. She later described that first year back as genuinely stressful, juggling homework, tests, and a touring schedule that kept pulling her away from class. A sold-out tour that had originally been planned as a modest handful of shows exploded into dozens of dates across the country. She was flying out for weekend performances and flying back in time for Monday classes, trying to hold 2 entirely different lives together at once. It's easy to romanticize that kind of schedule from the outside. Private jets, screaming fans, a golden trophy on the shelf. It's much harder to actually live through it as a 14-year-old, trying not to fall behind in algebra. By her freshman year, the balancing act had become unsustainable in the traditional format, and she made the decision to switch to homeschooling. She's been candid that it wasn't an easy call. She loved her friends. She loved the ordinary rhythm of hallway conversations and cafeteria lunches, and stepping away from that wasn't something she did lightly. But it gave her something she desperately needed: flexibility. No more cramming a week's worth of missed assignments into a single weekend between shows. What's striking, listening to her talk about that period years later, is how unsentimental she is about it. She doesn't frame it as a tragedy. She frames it as a trade-off, a decision that cost her something real, a conventional teenage social life, in exchange for something else, the ability to keep pursuing a career she'd worked for since she was 6 years old. That kind of clear-eyed pragmatism from a young teenager is its own quiet form of resilience, even if it doesn't come with a dramatic musical cue. If there's a genuine emotional through line to Darci Lynne's story, it isn't a hidden health crisis or a secret breakdown. It's something subtler and, in a way, more universal: the experience of being permanently associated with who you were at 12 years old, while every year that passes you keep growing into someone else. She's talked about this directly. Years after her win, she told one interviewer that people had essentially frozen her at the age she won the show, that no matter how much time passed, the image that came to most people's minds was still a middle schooler with a rabbit puppet. For anyone, having your identity locked to a single moment from childhood would be strange. For someone whose entire career was built on that moment, it's a genuinely complicated thing to carry. How do you honor the thing that gave you everything, while also insisting that you're allowed to become someone different? That tension came to a head in early 2024, when 19-year-old Darci returned to the AGT universe on the spin-off Fantasy League. She opened her performance the way everyone expected, puppet in hand, mid-song, and then, partway through, she set Petunia down, picked up a guitar, and finished the number as herself. No puppet, no character voice. Just her. It didn't go the way she hoped. The judges were kind, but visibly hesitant. Several of them said, in one way or another, that they missed the ventriloquism that had made her famous in the first place. She ended up getting eliminated before the final round. But when asked about it afterward, she didn't express regret. Her explanation was simple. She didn't want to be limited to one box for the rest of her life. Singing, she pointed out, had actually come before ventriloquism in her own personal history. She was writing melodies and harmonizing long before she ever picked up a puppet. The show had just never had room to display that side of her. The most interesting chapter of Darci Lynne's story might be the one that happened almost entirely out of the public eye. The pandemic years, when touring stopped and she found herself, for the first time in a long time, with nothing scheduled. She's described that stretch as disorienting. She hadn't been home for extended periods in years, and suddenly she had no idea what to do with unstructured time. Instead of treating it as dead space, she used it to teach herself songwriting from scratch. No formal lessons, no big announcement, just a teenager alone with a guitar figuring out how to turn feelings into lyrics. That period eventually produced Push Our Luck, her debut single released in February 2024, co-written with Oklahoma musicians Maggie McClure and Shane Henry. A bright, nervy song about the specific feeling of a first date, inspired by an actual relationship she'd been in. The accompanying music video went on to win Best Music Video at the Los Angeles Film Awards that year. Around the same time, she stepped into acting for the first time, co-starring in the Netflix film A Cowgirl Song, as a barrel racer rebuilding her confidence after a serious injury. She said the role resonated with her specifically because it was about someone who had to rediscover trust in herself after being knocked down, which, for a performer who spent her adolescence trying to prove she was more than a single viral moment, doesn't feel like a coincidence. None of this reads like tragedy. It reads like a young person doing the unglamorous, deliberate work of figuring out who she is outside of the identity a television show handed her at 12. That's a much less sensational story than child stars secretly falling apart behind the scenes, but it also happens to be the true one, and honestly, it's a more useful story for anyone else growing up with expectations they didn't choose. It would be dishonest to pretend that sudden fame at 12 years old came with zero cost. Darci Lynne has been open about the stress of those early years, the missed school time, the pressure of a packed touring schedule, the strange experience of being permanently associated with a single childhood performance. Those are real, well-documented parts of her story, and they matter. What isn't documented, and what this video won't pretend to know, is anything about her private health or mental state beyond what she has chosen to share publicly. She hasn't spoken about panic attacks or chronic illness in her own interviews, and it would be irresponsible, not to mention unfair to her, to invent details like that just to make the story feel more dramatic. The real story doesn't need embellishment. A kid who was painfully shy, who taught herself to throw her voice in a bathroom mirror, who won the biggest talent competition in the country, who then had to go back to 8th grade the following Monday, who chose homeschooling so she could keep performing without falling behind academically, who spent a lockdown year teaching herself to write songs, and who, at 19, walked onto a national stage and deliberately risked her most reliable act just to prove she was more than one trick. That's a genuinely compelling story on its own terms. One thing that does hold up under scrutiny is how consistently Darci Lynne has used her visibility for causes outside her own career. She's made appearances at children's hospitals with her puppets, bringing a bit of ordinary joy into places where ordinary joy is in short supply. She's also lent her name and time to organizations like Horses for Mental Health, which uses equine therapy as part of its approach to emotional well-being. Work she's spoken about with genuine enthusiasm rather than the polished detachment of an ambassador just fulfilling a contract. It's worth noting that she doesn't frame any of this as redemption from some hidden personal struggle. She talks about it more simply. She had a platform relatively early in life, and she chose to point some of it somewhere other than herself. That's a smaller, quieter kind of generosity than the secretly suffering star finds healing through advocacy. Arc that gets attached to a lot of young performer stories. But it might also be the more admirable version, precisely because it isn't built on anyone's private pain. Today, Darci Lynne is in her early 20s, still based in Oklahoma, still writing music, still occasionally bringing Petunia out for old time's sake, and by her own account, still feeling like a fairly ordinary person navigating an unusual set of circumstances. She's talked about dating, about her friendships, about the strange experience of having millions of people hold a permanent mental image of her as a sixth grader. None of that is a crisis. It's just what it looks like when someone grows up with an unusually public starting point and has to do the very normal work of becoming an adult anyway, deciding what to keep from who you were and what to leave behind. Maybe that's the more honest takeaway here. Not every young performer's story needs a hidden tragedy to be worth telling. Sometimes the real story is simpler and, in its own way, more impressive. A shy kid built an entire career out of throwing her voice through a puppet, discovered a whole other voice buried underneath that one, and had the nerve, in front of the same judges who made her famous, to risk the first voice in order to show them the second. That's not a downfall. That's just what growing up looks like when the whole world happens to be watching.